Hi, I'm Evan Shin, and I'm from Seattle, and I'm a literacy coach. And we are super excited to have you here for our study session, right? Or is it study? What is it called? Shauna, what is it called?
It's the Ed Collab gathering session.
Okay, well, I know that, but wasn't there like a session that he called it something else?
I
I feel like
did.
it studies something. Anyway, we're glad that you're here. We're glad you're here at the Ed Gathering. It's going to be really fun. Shauna, tell us about yourself. Who are you?
Oh, hi. I am an education consultant and literacy specialist from New Hampshire. I am a 3-year member of the Educator Collaborative, and I'm so excited to be here sharing the brilliance of Evan with everybody today.
Oh my gosh, I love that you're very sweet. So nice. Oh my gosh. All right. You want to start us off?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking to you today about discovering identity in a virtual space. And identity is one of those things that is always important to consider because, and I'm going to flash a book here, as Dr. Goldie Muhammad says in her brilliant book,
Love that book.
Cultivating Genius, I
Yes.
know, identity and learning are deeply connected and cannot be decontextualized from one another. And in this moment in particular, it is even more important, regardless of whether you are teaching remotely, in person, or gosh forbid, doing both. I think many of us can agree that getting to know each other can be really difficult and really challenging, especially under these circumstances. And there are a lot of anxieties on both sides around health and safety, particularly for our Black and Brown children. In addition to that, engaging in one another remotely takes a lot more emotional capacity.
I know.
Right?
I'm exhausted. I don't know about
I'm
you.
already
I am
exhausted. Yeah, like I
after
just need to
a
get.
Zoom call.
No, totally. Yeah, absolutely. It takes a lot of emotional effort. And even if you're currently working with students in person, you are hopefully masking up your social distancing. And with all of those elements, plus the additional anxieties around this crisis situation that we're in today, it makes it even that much more difficult to connect and engage with one another. So today, Evan and I will be sharing lots of ideas with you around what you might do to explore identity with your students, not only in service to their and your social emotional needs, but also in service to their intellectual growth as well. So let me get started by sharing my screen. This is always the awkward part.
Here we go. It's here.
You
got
can
it.
See? Okay.
We can see it.
All right, let me go into present mode. Here we go.
All right. And so there are what you want me to, okay, yeah. All right,
Yeah,
there
you
are
can
3
do that.
parts to, okay, I got it. Then there are 3 parts to what we're going to be talking about today with regards to thinking about identity in the classroom, particularly in this virtual space. The first part is generating material and collecting data. And I know that data seems like such a it's a mathy term. I know that when we get there, when we get to that space, we're always like, oh no, they're talking about data, they're talking about numbers. My students aren't numbers, right? What we're thinking about when we're talking about data is really generating a whole bunch of ideas. When we think about the writing process, it's all about generating. And that generating comes from within oftentimes. It comes from what we're looking around us, right? And so in that work, we're going to think about generating material and collecting data. And there's a lot of different ways that we do that. And so we're going to be looking at some of those ways that you can do that even in a virtual space. After that, we're going to be looking at how do we use that data and how do we use all the material that students come with us. When a student brings a dog up to the camera, how can we use that dog as leverage in order to write more, right? How can we use that dog to help us tell a story? How can we use that dog to maybe write a how-to manual, right? And we're going to be thinking about also in angles and lenses. What are some themes? Maybe the student has a whole bunch of stuffed animals. So that tells us a little bit more about them as a collector, right? And so we're going to start be looking for themes and lenses and angles of how we can look at that work. And then finally, we're going to also be thinking about the so what. So after we've done all this stuff, all of this learning, what are we going to do with that? And so we're really excited to be able to spend some time talking about this.
That's right. And then the other thing to think about is that when we're doing this kind of identity work, there are really three prongs that are equally as important, although I would argue that the first prong is the most important, so that you are not perpetuating any harm or causing any harm in the work, for the students with whom you're doing this identity work. So making sure that you're doing some self-identity work is very important. I initially had educators here, but we're not all instructional in the classroom necessarily. But I also want us to think of ourselves as individuals. Is my internet connection okay, Evan? Are you hearing me?
You broke up just a little bit, so
Oh,
maybe
okay.
yeah.
Okay. So that self piece is really important. Obviously, there's also the work that you're doing with students, but also equally as important is doing that identity work in order to help support families and caregivers. So this might mean being really proactive in the ways that we offer resources. Maybe we offer some conversation starters to kind of engage in if families and caregivers have the time and the capacity to do that. But really making sure that we're including them in this entire process, because that's really important. So I think those three prongs are really super important. And then the other thing is that often when we talk about identity, we think about terms of, who am I? So, and having students really look inward. And that obviously is very important. But I think if we stop there, that's not enough. And
It's not just about me.
Right. It's not just about
It's
us.
not just about me.
Right, exactly. And so we need to think also in terms of communities, all the different communities in which we're a part. So not only who am I, but who are we? Who am I in different spaces? What are the many communities to which I belong, including virtual communities? What are the relational aspects of my identity? And how do I affect others and how do others affect me? And then also, who are we globally and how do we fit into the bigger picture, both globally and historically? So those are important components as well. So let's start talking about generating material and collecting data. Do you say data or data?
I say data, but I feel like because you're from New Hampshire, maybe it's data. I don't know.
No. You say data and I'll say data, and then we'll have both.
And then we'll have both, and then I'll be there, and then we'll have the right answer no matter what,
Okay.
no matter what anybody says.
Right.
So there's a lot of different ways that you can do community building. One of the beautiful things I just love about what Shauna was saying is the fact that we are so much of everything that's around us, right? And it's not just who am I, but the communities that I belong in, right? And one of those communities that you're a part of is oftentimes like social media, and you're thinking about Spotify. And so one thing that you could be thinking about is, what music do students listen to, right? And one of the things that I did is I created like a 11th grade humanities playlist, and students all gave me a song that they are currently listening to, a song that we have to all listen to as a group. And of course, you want to be, aware of like if it has explicit language in it. And even so, allowing students to be free to talk about that. I think that for me, at least, I don't know about you, Shauna, but I know music, there's something that's deeply personal about music. Mm-hmm. Like when somebody's like, I hate the Backstreet Boys, or I hate this. I remember that being like,
that was
so like, what a dagger. Like, they're like, oh, we're not friends anymore then, right? I don't know if it was that intense. Sometimes it was. But there's something intensely personal about that. And so that's a great place to be thinking about in terms of use, in terms of data. Something else that you also posted up here as well, just a couple of ways that you can take information as well from students, right? And so you can use I want to say that's a Jamboard. Is that right? That's a
It is a
Jamboard?
Jamboard. Yeah, I'll actually, let me go back and I'll make it bigger.
Oh, I
So
love it. Okay.
yeah, it's really cool. So I'm really new to Jamboard, but it's really fun. One of the ways that I use it, as this is loading, is
Yeah.
I use it to sort of it's sort of like a game in some way, or
Mm.
maybe an icebreaker at the beginning of class. And so you know that game Would You Rather? Have you ever
Oh
played
yeah.
that?
Oh yeah.
Okay, so
Absolutely love it.
yeah, so you could use Jamboard to play Would You Rather, and I've seen them out there. I've seen some versions of this. Like there's one called This or That, and you'd have like hard ice cream or soft ice cream, which is
Hmm.
cool. Don't get me wrong, that's
Hmm.
interesting too. But I when I think about Would You Rather questions, I'm really trying to get at kind of deeper things,
Yep.
and
Yep.
collect some kind of more interesting data.
Hmm.
And so here's just one example. Would you rather have a few really close friends or a whole bunch of acquaintances? And just have students kind of take their, here's Kamala taking her post-it and moving it to
Hmm.
where, you know, she feels the most comfortable. And then just another example, would you rather be the worst player on a team that always wins or the best player on a team that always
I'm
loses?
about winning. It's winning all the way.
Well,
No?
even if you're the worst player?
Um, I think that still means that I won. So
Yeah,
like
that's
it
true.
doesn't matter how I get the gold medal as long as I'm
True.
getting the gold medal.
True, true, true. Yeah, I'd have to
So,
think about this. This is a hard one, I think. So this would generate a lot of discussion. So the point of these would you rather's is really to generate discussion afterward, which is the whole fun of it. But another thing that I like to do is to use,
oh
okay,
my
another,
gosh, I
do we do
cannot
GIF
right
or
now.
GIF? GIF or GIF?
It's GIF. I
Okay,
say
that's
GIF.
what
I don't care. I know it's
okay.
GIF. I say GIF.
I agree that like most people say it's supposed to be GIF, but I say GIF. So GIFs, I use GIFs. Because they're just darn fun. If I
Hmm.
could communicate solely in GIFs, I would. But
Absolutely.
using it to just ask students to think about their mood
Hmm.
that day. And when I talk about students or learners, I've worked with kindergartners all the way up to grown-ups. And so I use this kind of stuff with all learners. Here's another one. Which GIF best describes for you what it feels like to, and
Oh
maybe
my
you
gosh,
have
that's so
a
great.
prompt here. So like, what does it feel like to work in a breakout group on Zoom? You know, you can really
Mm.
get a sense of, you know, how kids feel about certain things or how students feel about certain things. So I like to use Jamboard. I also occasionally use Poll Everywhere,
Love pull everywhere.
right?
Absolutely.
So this one, as it's loading, so here's just a question that I would potentially ask a group that I was working with. How do you think others see you versus, and then how might they describe you? And just ask folks to put in one or two words or phrases. And this one in particular, I believe, is to create a word cloud. So you can see what
Mm.
words come up most often. So, and then another thing that I love, another tool I love to use is Book Creator.
Hmm.
And in terms of building community, one of the ways that I love using Book Creator is to create shared text.
I
So
love
for
it.
example, I know, right? So,
It's so fun. Oh my gosh. Okay.
so we could like create a shared text about our writing identities. Um, and I just, Book Creator, you can, you know, well, you can find out about it and it's
I'm
free and
assuming you create books.
you create books
Oh, okay.
and
Got it. All right. I got it.
you can
Okay.
create, yep,
Got it.
so you can choose your book shape, you
Oh,
can
that's
create
super fun.
different
Okay. Got
comics.
it.
But if I were to open this one up and just show you sort of what this might look like. So you can obviously go on and find out more about it and play around with it. But so here's just one example of a page. And so if
Oh,
we
that's
all sort of
awesome.
contributed some you know aspect of our writing identity. So I wrote how I love to
Mm.
write comics, listicles, and essays. I prefer to incorporate images or illustrations in my work, so on and so forth.
Mm.
So I also love using Book Creator
Mm.
to build community as well. And I just think that it's so important, like you said, to build a robust community in which there's trust,
Mm.
there's physical, social, and emotional safety, and there's transparency. I think transparency is really important when working with any kind of learner. So love the community building. And then, so those are just some ideas. Obviously, there are so many more ways to build community, but we're going to talk a little, we're going to have you do a little bit of writing. So in just a
Okay.
moment, we're going to ask you to pause the video. But many of you have seen the iceberg metaphor used when talking about aspects of culture, I would assume. And of course, culture is deeply embedded in notions of identity, but it can also, this whole metaphor can also be a useful tool when talking about identity itself, because obviously there are more visible aspects of our identity versus more hidden aspects of identity that are important to think about and consider, not only when thinking about ourselves and our own identities, but our interactions with others, as well as our participation within systems. So, in thinking about your own identity,
As and one of the things I think about,
yeah,
particularly as a person of color, as a Black man, I'm even thinking about the double consciousness, right? The as W.E.B. Du Bois talks about, like the fact that not only do I have to see myself, but I also have to see myself the way white people also see me, and I have to see myself the way other people see me, and doing both of and doing that work at the same time, right? And
yeah,
so it's almost like I have like two icebergs, and using you and that works oftentimes from, and that's from many of our students, right? That they are one thing to one at in one place, and they are another thing in another place, and they are both things. They aren't like, oh, they're like, oh, you're a fake or you're a fraud. No, we're both of those things. And so really having that conversation as well, but absolutely in terms of thinking about what we see on the outside, but also what's underneath. I love that.
yeah, I like it too. And I appreciate that you brought that up because that's something that, as a white person, I can never fully understand. I mean, you can talk, you know, you can think about in terms of, you know, very, I would say, somewhat similarly in terms of gender, but it's not at all the same. And so, really understanding that idea, double consciousness, is, I think, really important to talk about with kids. And especially, I think a lot of people think, well, why talk about race with predominantly white communities, learning communities? And I think it's especially important because if you think about how infrequently white folks talk about race, it's even more important to talk about those ideas and those concepts. So yeah, so we're gonna ask you to think about your own identity and think about what are some aspects of your identity that are fairly visible to others versus those aspects that are not as visible. So in thinking about those, we're going to ask you to sort of pause the video here and take a couple of minutes to write. You can sketch, you can jot, anything that comes to mind when you're thinking of both the visible and the less visible aspects of your identity. And then we'll share a little bit about our own. Okay, so hopefully you pause because we're giving you no time. And so do you want to start, Evan, by just sharing
I'll share a little bit about
yeah,
myself. So something you would see on the outside. I'm a bigger guy. I'm a Black guy. I love to laugh. I wear glasses. Um, However, something you may not know about me is that I struggle with depression. It's something that has run in my family, and it's something that's been something that I openly talk about because it's something we don't talk about. We don't talk about mental health. We are able to talk about we're able to talk about somebody breaking their arm or somebody getting cancer, but we're not able to talk about mental health. And so it's something that's really important to me. And so I also happen to be a gay male as well. And so that's something else that also is part of my intersectionality and figuring out what does that all mean to me, and how does that develop, and how does that create, and how does that how does that affect how I read the world? And I think about that all the time, and that's something we encourage our students to do as well. How about you,
yeah.
Shauna? What about you? Who are you?
Well, so I wrote some things down. So I am I'm a white. I think I'm a um, fairly I don't even know how to put it, but I think most people would assume I'm cis, that I'm a woman. I am 45 years old. I know that's visible, but not everyone knows that I'm 45. So, but it's true. I'm of European descent. I've had people tell me before that I live the perfect life. But underneath all of that, and I certainly I feel very privileged, and I don't want for anything. But underneath that, I also suffer from depression. I have for many, many years. It also runs in my family. I suffer from anxiety, a relatively mild form of OCD that certainly affects my life. And then something that also not many people see, because I also love to laugh and I'm pretty bubbly in person, is that I like really dark things. So like
Oh my
if you
gosh,
were
I can't wait.
if you were to ever look at, okay, so if you look at my Netflix queue or my iBooks, library, serial killers, cults, all that kind of stuff. That is
Are you a
something
conspiracy theorist? Like, are you about that, or
no,
no? Okay, first of all, the way
no.
you say it, you're like, no, you're like,
I
yeah.
like learn.
Like,
No. I like learning about people who are
okay, okay.
interested in that stuff. But I'm fascinated with human behavior, especially darker aspects of it. But I think most people, upon seeing me or interacting with me on a surface level, wouldn't guess that. So that's definitely a less visible aspect of my identity.
That's awesome.
So that's just a little bit about us.
Yeah.
So hopefully you got some insight about yourself as well. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some ways to spark some thinking about identity. So we're still in that kind of generating material, collecting data kind of aspect of the presentation. And one of the ways that I find is probably one of the more accessible ways for educators to spark thinking around identity is through texts. And when I talk about text, I'm always talking about more than just printed text. So you see some of those texts that we would absolutely recommend that are alphabetic, but also incorporate some visual modalities. But I also, when I talk about text, I'm talking videos, I'm talking memes, I'm talking comics. And so that's one way to spark thinking about identity is to incorporate text in your work with learners. And then also shared experiences. So for example, one shared experience might be creating a class playlist, right? Like you said, and that's something that I love to do with learners of all ages too, because you're right, music is such a personal thing, and it just, you can use it in all different ways. You can create a class playlist for when we need to chill, and then you can create one for when we need to pump ourselves up. And so those kind of shared experiences can help really spark thinking around identity as well. Exploring materials. And so when I think about materials, I think about the Reggio Emilia approach, which is really, for those of you who don't know, it originated in Northern Italy. And it's an approach to early childhood education that I think extends to all learning and teaching. And they often use natural materials to explore and discover things. And so you might ask students to explore some clay, and you could ask something like, how does your play with this clay material help you think about identity? Or what can colors tell us about identity? So you can just offer students invitations to kind of explore materials. And then there are lots of invitations that you can use. And I use invitations because I truly am inviting students to try things out, my learners to try things out, and to just kind of course, I've hopefully built that trusting community. And so some possible invitations that you could ask students to engage in include things like creating annotated lists. So for example, one of my favorite things to do is to think everybody kind of talks about things like list 10 things you love to do or 10 things you're really good at, but being dark, I like to go the opposite way. So I'd ask students I'd invite students to create a list of things that you wish you loved, but actually don't.
Mm, mm. I like that.
Or
I like that.
yeah, or something, just kind of twist it up a bit. And then another idea is to ask them to engage in some sketching, and you can do, really, the sky's the limit. But there's all kinds of ideas, creating maps. I'll show you an example of that. Timelines. So just real quick, this is a really quick example of a map.
Oh my
You
gosh,
could
look at
invite.
all those tabs you have open right
Shh, don't draw attention to that. I guess you can while
now.
it's
Oh my
loading.
gosh.
But
Okay, let's
anyway,
see.
don't. You don't want to know
Oh,
what's on there. So I don't know how many
okay.
of you know this. Have you ever used Google Earth to create a map?
I have used Google Earth before. I'm intrigued to see how you use it.
Okay, wait, hold on. Here, it's in this tab here. I don't want to wait for it to load. So this is just one quick example. So I recently took a trip with family and friends to Acadia National Park. And so one of the things you could ask students to do is to map an experience out. It doesn't have to be necessarily a trip. It doesn't have to be real. It can be a fictionalized or a wish kind of trip. But if I just start presenting here, you can see. So it
Oh,
takes
it's
you
super
to,
fun.
isn't
So you
that
can put
cool?
like a pit. Yeah, you can put like a picture.
Yeah,
Oh,
you
and
can
then you can include text too.
yes. So you can
Oh
totally
wow.
annotate it. You can even change the little icons here. You can totally make it your own. And then if you continue, and I know this might not translate well with the internet connection, but so this is where we stayed, and so I have a picture here with some text and so on and so forth. Let me get out of that because it's probably using up valuable connection. Okay. And then the other thing I wanted to show you, have you ever created an annotated playlist?
I haven't done an annotated playlist. I have created a playlist, but not an annotated one.
So this is inspired by Questlove's annotated playlist, My Youth in 27 Records, which is something I use all the time with groups of
Oh, okay,
learners.
okay, all right,
And
okay.
and and one of my students this past summer in the New Hampshire Literacy Institutes created this incredibly amazing timeline of music of her youth that totally inspired me to use Padlet, because she used Padlet to do
Oh,
it.
love it. I'm a
You can
huge, yes,
you
Padlet.
Yeah, you could use a lot of different applications, but this was really
I've never
cool.
used is I've never found a reason to use the timeline function. So I'm
No,
intrigued.
right. And so I unfortunately can't play them for you because of permissions, but after this I can play them. But so you can upload a link to the actual song, and then add some text, and it's just super, super fun and super cool. And again, you're generating so much material around
Mm-hmm,
identity.
mm-hmm.
And then another idea is to create soundscapes of, environmental soundscapes. What do things sound like around you? How do the sounds around you kind of make up part of your identity? So those are just some.
Yeah, and I wanted to actually jump back on. Will you go back just one slide? I
Yeah,
wanted to jump back on, um, as we're starting to think about the way we spark identity as well, is just thinking about the fact that for some students, it is way easier for them to talk about a character in a book rather than it is for them to talk about themselves.
yeah.
And one of the best ways I can use to describe that is I remember a parent came up to me one day. I was in the grocery store, and they said, "I'm worried." Like they were like worried, and can I talk to you about something, Mr. Shen? And I was like, "Yeah, sure. What's going on?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm worried that so and so is gay." and I'm worried that she's not going to come out. And I said, okay, um, well, it's way easier for a student to come out when they know that the family is going to be accepting of it. And so when you are walking along the street and you see two men holding hands, like, wow, isn't that beautiful? Like, how beautiful is it that they can hold hands, that they are just so comfortable with themselves, and that they are, but that's true love. Like, isn't that great?
Mm-hmm.
um and by doing that, you're affirming that. And I also want to talk, specifically also about the way we're choosing our text as well
Yes.
matter,
Thank
right?
you.
We are not going to just choose text, sometimes even texts that are comfortable for us, because that's very easy to do, right? We're going to choose texts that reflect the students that we teach. um, and and so just be thinking about that. I know, Shauna, did you want to speak something about that a little bit more?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, just like whenever I'm presenting around something and I'm offering, I have like a visual of text like this slide. It's very, very intentional. So
yeah.
so in my case, where I have taught in predominantly white classrooms and
Hmm.
predominantly white communities, I try to choose texts that are not mirrors of themselves, to quote Rudy and Sims Bishop. Um, and so I try to really find texts that are just more widely representative of different identities. And so these are just some that I've loved. If you haven't, this one is a particular favorite, Show Me a Sign. So I
I read
read
that
this
one.
as that you read it.
I haven't read it. No.
Oh, it's so good. It's a perfect read aloud for, I would say, if you teach multi-age and you're in a 3-4, it's perfectly appropriate. But if you're in straight grade levels, I would say 4 on up. It's just
Okay.
an
All right.
excellent text. And the main character is deaf, and the author is deaf as well. So it's an own voices text. But I absolutely agree with you that the selection of text is super, super important. And whatever choice you make is political. So
Mm.
make really intentional choices about the kinds of text that you're choosing. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yeah, absolutely. Um,
Yeah. Did you want to
yeah.
say anything more?
Oh, and then also, like, another shared experience is
Oh yeah.
one of the new games that I have learned because of the fact that we are now kind of in this virtual space. Is we just started practicing this game called Cameras On, Cameras Off. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. You just say, like, cameras on if you like ice cream. And usually you start off with something like pretty soft, right? And then you can gradually get into harder questions with your group as trust builds,
Hmm.
right? And so you might even go like, cameras on if you know somebody who has had a run-in with police, right?
Hmm.
And then now, like, and one, it starts bonding kids,
Yeah.
especially in this space where they don't know, they don't see each other. Then they're saying to themselves, like, "Oh, I'm not the only one, right?
Yeah.
I know somebody else who has had a bad run-in with the police as well, right?"
Hmm.
And the more we can create subgroups in our class, the more we can forge that belonging sense, right? That we don't all have to be just one big conglomerate, but rather we are all we have a bunch of subgroups, and there's a bunch of us that we can gather around multiple identities together as a class. And so I just think about that. It's very similar to the game, like, trying to think, like the winds blow. I remember that one.
Oh
The
yeah.
winds blow. Like, but
Yeah.
you're just like, and we have to be ingenious educators in the space of finding ways to integrate games and integrate those other ways that we can talk about. Otherwise, we can play together. And I love that you brought that
Right.
in. So, yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate that because play is something that learners of all ages need to do, including our age. Well, my age too, because I am old. I'm the
We can say
oldest
our
one in the
age.
room.
I mean, I'm not in my 40s yet, but you know, but okay,
Okay. All right.
okay,
So
yeah,
you wanna take this one?
yeah. So when we talk about that, so we have all of this data, we have all of this information. We've been taking copious notes, we've been thinking in our heads. We are no longer those people who are going to hand out that survey at the beginning of the year that says, "What's your favorite candy bar?" And then throw it in a binder and never look at it again, because we're just not those people anymore. I will say I was absolutely that person. I would
Me too.
do that survey that I knew everybody was supposed to do first day of school, and then it went into a binder. And I don't know if I looked at it one time. I may have looked at it once or twice, but I had every great intention to do it, and you just never did it. So now we need to be thinking about how can we leverage and start mining this work into craft, right? And so one of the activities that I had the chance of doing when I went to a racial equity institute with Trisha and Dr. Sonia Cherry Paul, and we did this activity, and it was really beautiful, and it was a personal timeline, and I used it with my students immediately, and they were like, it was amazing. And one of the things that we did was we took this timeline and you just create a whole bunch of things that happen in your life. What are some things that what are some things now for me, sometimes for students, it's really easy to be like, maybe they want to say like, oh, kindergarten, first, second, third grade, whatever. But then sometimes that you might not know. And so maybe you're doing like an era of your life. And then what you do is on top of that, afterwards, and you'll see in red, I started writing, and I finished it later. But then in another color, you're gonna want to try to label. You're gonna try to find themes in your life. So maybe you want to say, oh, wait, let's go back and let's look at gender.
Mm.
Where do we see, where do we see that maybe being a guy played a role? Maybe you're looking at race. Where do we see race? Because what we're starting to see now is oftentimes, particularly in the upper grades, we want students to move from the personal narrative, like the one story, to the multiple stories,
Mhm.
right? And oftentimes students have a difficult time doing that because they're like, all right, this is my story. I've told the story about my dog dying. This is the same story I'm going to use. When else has death come up in your life? And
Mm.
it may not be a physical death, but it might be a metaphorical death, right? And so now we're starting to mine this information. And it's just like a really beautiful thing. I also tend to draw pictures as well, so it's also really fun to encourage kids to doodle. I did mine sideways. You'll see a lot of students, but making the notebook their own. All
Yeah.
right, so that's one thing.
Okay.
Another thing I think about as well is like thinking about what lenses we're using as well. And I think about just exactly what Rudine Bishop talks about of like windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors, right? And that every book that we read, when we're rereading a book, we're rereading it through a different lens. When I was watching Harry Potter the other night, like you start seeing like, oh, I never noticed that. Like, oh, I never saw them alluding to that relationship, or I never noticed that they were talking about gender here, or
Mhm.
they were alluding to Dumbledore's sexuality, or like, and you never see those things until you are watching it with that eye. And so encouraging students to start saying, you know what? I love that you read this book and I love that you picked it again. What if you read it this time? Just looking for how does the author tell us about what does it mean to be a male?
Mm.
Or what does it mean to be a good person? Right?
Mhm.
Or what does it mean to be single? Right? Because we read books through different lenses. And it's just like a really beautiful way as we're starting to think about kids reading and writing things, that it's a really beautiful thing that helps us.
Yeah, I love doing this with media, and the kids that I've been privileged to work with have really taken to this idea of looking at things through a different lens. And just as one example, we were doing with a 5-6 multi-age classroom, I was co-teaching an inquiry around single stories or stereotypes. And they were based on their interests and what kind of the sparks were. We were really focused on gender, race, and ethnicity. And so we started looking at movie posters and like movie trailers. And I told them about this game I used to play with I have 2 girls, and we would go to the movies way back when.
Weird. I don't remember that. I don't recall.
And
That
we would
never
watch,
happened.
right. And we would watch the trailers, and I'd say, let's count how many trailers are about boys and their stories. And and once we started doing that, we were like, oh my gosh, like 90% of the movies are about
Wow.
male characters. And so I would have students look at movie posters, but we would look at it, with an intersectional lens, and we look at it through race, but in particular, what I would ask them to notice is who's front and center, who's represented to the largest on the poster, and who's kind of around or in the background. And so that's just one way that I use lenses to help us kind of re-look at things, which was really fun. Oh, and so we can look at things through different lenses. We can return to texts of all kinds and look at them through a different lens. And the other thing we can do or we can write text using a different lens. But the other thing we can do is to look at it from a different angle. And one of the ways that I help learners do this is through different modalities and different forms of writing. So just as one example, this is many people are familiar with George Ella Lyons's poem, Where I'm From. So we could have students create their own Where I'm From poem, but in order to kind of get at a different angle and maybe some other new insights, we could ask them to digitize it and to add video and sound, just like this beautiful example here, which is actually, it's going to be linked on our resources page, because again, I don't have permissions to share it, but I just wanted to make the point that we can look at things through different lenses and also look at it from different angles and gain additional insights.
And then another way, I think about this as well, particularly with students who are in our intervention classes, students who are furthest from educational justice, the students who are struggling the most. Those are the students who oftentimes need to dig deep into their identity. We need to dig deep into who do they believe they are, right? And how do we build that into them? How do we build them up? And one of the things that Alfred Tatum talks about is he talks about creating identities that we want students to role play in their lives, right? And one of the things I want students to be eventually in their life is I want them to be readers. And in order for them to do that, I need to create in them a reading identity. I need to have them play act what it means to be a reader. And part of that means that I'm going to go through, and one of the first activities you could do is you could have them create a reading timeline. And as you go through this reading timeline, and as you create this reading timeline, you can have students kind of think through and say like, wow, like what did I used to do? Oh yeah, I did that. Like, oh, I loved like reading The Giving Tree and then I realized, oh, it's a little problematic. You know, tree keeps giving, what's going on there? But I remember like, and then I also like found, and it was interesting because I was like, oh, and then I was super into Cam Jansen. And I remember reading deeply into Number of the Stars was like a big book for me. And then Henry and Mudge. And I was deep into the Henry and Mudge series, right? But then, things started to taper off. And so one of the things we can have students do, once again, is to mine their life, right? Mining their life for trends, for genres, for volume. These are all things that teach us as teachers how to teach them better, but also to put it back into their hands and say like, man, wow, I was a really big reader, and then maybe something happened. What happened? What was going on there? And reshaping that and giving them an opportunity to take some self-efficacy and to say like, this is going to change. I know that I can be a reader. I know this is who I can be.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. And I think too, we can do the same thing with writing too.
Yeah.
And if I think about all my writer's notebooks and I sort of go back through and mine it for themes and patterns, it would be interesting to see what themes and patterns emerge. I mean, I think I can think of in terms of form and genre, but in terms of content would be a whole different story. It'd be interesting to go back and kind of take a look at that. So we're really running over.
Oh my gosh, we are running out of time. Oh my gosh.
I know. So
yes.
I'm going to go through the name stuff because I think the last part is really, really important.
Absolutely.
So we just wanted to share some examples of ways that you can use work with students' names to generate data and material around identity. So really, again, bringing in different multimodal texts around names, thinking about stories around names, and offering students invitations to think about not just, for some students, they might not know the origin story of their name, or they might be adopted and have their original name, and their caregivers that they're with now might not know. But you can, that's why that community building is so important, so that your students and what they're going to feel comfortable with and trusting you with. But there's so much that you can do around names. And so these are just some examples. So this particular activity, I modified from Teaching History in Ourselves, which we're going to give a shout out to at the end too. This is called What's in a Name. So there are just 5 different quotes about names, and you can just ask students to choose a couple of quotations that resonate with them and just jot, why that is, and just generate some discussion around that. You can just ask students simply to write, sketch, or jot about their name and see what comes up, especially after having read a couple of texts or viewed some texts around names. So there's just so much you can do there to gather and generate material around identity. But this is so, so important. And I'm so grateful that Evan really was the driving force behind this part of the presentation, this so what. So I don't know. Do you want to say anything to
Okay, we'll see. Let's see what is the so what? Why does this all matter? And so there's a few things of why we're thinking about this matters. One is to facilitate broader and deeper discussions around identity, privilege, and power. So when we're thinking about this work, we're thinking about what are we going to push students to do because of this, right? We want students to not have this work insular. Particularly, think about this time. This is a great time for students to be doing things in the community in terms of like making a poster and putting it up on a wall someplace, or creating, working on a mural or painting something. Like, this is a chance for them, or writing a petition. These are all things that students can do just because of the fact that they mine their own life for something they saw was unfair, or something they saw that needed to change. So that's one thing. Yeah.
And even when I was working with kindergartners I was co-teaching a inquiry around gender and single stories and stereotypes around gender. And our kindergartners, I mean, some of them had just turned 5 and at the start of this inquiry. And, when I go back and consult and visit that school, a lot of those same kindergartners will come up to me and be like, who are now 2nd and 3rd graders, will be like, Ms. Coppola, I saw another single story about gender, and we taught them how, we gave them some language for how to disrupt those stereotypes and single stories. And so they tell me these stories about that. And so it can be that kind of advocacy work too, which just makes kids feel really empowered and makes them, they just understand that they do have a voice and that they can change the way things are. Yeah.
Oh, and then that goes right into our same work of like thinking about creating things for authentic audiences, right? We now live very much so in a technologically savvy world, and the students are very technologically savvy. What can they do on TikTok? What can they do on Instagram? What can they do in a newspaper? What can they do? What are some authentic audiences that they can write for so that it brings more meaning to their learning, right? That they are not performing for us, but rather they are telling a story because they think that it's worth telling, that they deserve to have a voice. And I think that that's something, if we can bring voice into their work, it's going to be a really beautiful thing.
Yeah, and there's just so many ways to do that. Like, we've talked about all the way through this. There's just so many different ways that don't just incorporate alphabetic text all the time, but that's certainly such a powerful way to share stories and to share one's voice. But there's spoken word poetry, there's creating digital artifacts. I mean, there's just so many different ways to create and share text that demonstrate all of this learning and insight around identity. And then the last thing we have here is and I have a GIF of an arrow pointing to it, because this is really, this obviously could be a whole session, it could be a whole course, it could be a whole lifetime of learning, is to use what you've learned about your students and about your own identity work to make your curriculum, your pedagogy, and your practice more culturally responsive. This, again, is just so important. And so if we had all the time in the world, we could offer you a whole other presentation around how to do that. But just, one simple way to do that is to really think about the choices that you're making around text, just as one maybe starting point if this is beginning stage for you. But super important to not just think about how can we, what do we do with all of this for our students, or what can they do with all of this information, all of this new insight, but what can we do as educators is also important. So some further learning for you. These are some wonderful texts and resources that we would highly recommend. So definitely recommend you check them out. In particular, these 3 texts are excellent. And then if you're not familiar with the icons, we have Teaching Tolerance over on the top right, and then Facing History and Ourselves on the bottom are super great resources for further learning around identity as well. And then you have us too. So feel free to get in touch with us. These are our Twitter handles. This is the love that we now have.
I cannot right now. That is so extra. That is so, what is happening? That's like, you really extra. Do love gifts. That is I do. I'm telling you, that is your love language.
It is my love language.
Oh my gosh, gifts!
Oh my god! I have to tell my partner right away. Yes. But anyway, I just want to thank you, Evan, for engaging in this work with me. I have learned so much just from working with you, and
oh my God.
I've had so much fun, and I hope folks have gotten some good ideas out of this.
Yeah, it's same, like ditto. Like, I can't believe I'm working with Shauna, like a published author, and now I'm like, I'm like, make sure you have a chance to see if you can read her book if you have a chance to.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. All right, folks, take care and enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the gathering. Thanks for being with us.